I barged into an office and telling them to make stop their kid from opening our office door. I work in one of those older office buildings. The kind that could be charming if you didn't have to spend most of your waking hours there. It's got creaky floors, dim hallways, and fluorescent lights that always seem on the verge of giving up. Each floor holds a variety of offices, mostly small companies and startup ventures. All crammed together to save on rent. And then there's my office, nestled in the middle of the building, where I've been working at a law firm since graduating. It's a quiet space, a little worn around the edges like the building itself. But we keep it professional. That's what law is about. Really, order, structure, a sense of calm focus. Our office, with its quiet tones and thick carpets, has always seemed to be a world apart from some of the other businesses in the building. On one side, there's a real estate office that stays busy but keeps to themselves. Not much trouble there. Then there's the telemarketing office. They're noisy. They're constantly rotating new faces. And the people seem to shout every conversation as if they're getting paid by the decibel. It's a chaotic contrast to our place. I've had more than one day interrupted by their voices drifting down the hall. But I learned to live with it. You pick your battles in a place like this. The office I work in is steady, structured. We work with numbers, files, cases, and strict deadlines. Conversations are kept low out of respect. And interruptions are, generally speaking, minimal. My coworkers and I have a kind of unspoken understanding about the importance of maintaining a quiet environment. Whether we're drafting contracts, working on briefs, or preparing for cases, our work demands focus, and we respect that about each other. Maintaining the peace and staying out of each other's way. Each of us silently battling our workload in the same room, day in and day out. It was that respect, that calm, that I grew accustomed to. The building had its quirks and annoyances. Yes. But our little corner of it had always been something of an oasis amid the noise. I never thought much about the other tenants, until the disruptions began. And they began innocently enough, a door opening, footsteps in the hallway, but they quickly grew into something far more relentless and aggravating. And so, day by day, the peace I had taken for granted started to chip away, and all eyes seemed to turn toward that one source of the disturbance, a kid. Running the halls every afternoon. And the one office that let it happen. The first time it happened, I dismissed it as just a kid being a kid. Our office door has a simple brass knob, one that clicks softly whenever it closes. And it doesn't take much for it to swing open with a pull. When I heard the doorknob rattle in the middle of a quiet afternoon, I assumed it was someone who'd accidentally walked into the wrong office. But when I looked up, I saw no adult, just a young boy, maybe 7 or 8, staring back at me. He was short, dark-haired, with that reckless energy kids always seem to have, even when they're doing nothing. He didn't say a word. He just grinned at me for a second, then slowly shut the door, and his footsteps trailed away down the hall. I assumed he was there with someone and thought nothing of it. But it happened again the next day, and the day after that. Every afternoon, around the same time, the door would fly open, sometimes with a bang, and there he'd be, peering in, seemingly for his own amusement. Sometimes he'd stick his head all the way in, gaze around, and then dart out like he'd seen something forbidden. At first, it was merely an annoyance, a little blip in the day. But quickly, it became a routine, and routines, especially disruptive ones, wear on you. I'm not sure if it was my workload, my dwindling patience, or just the fact that this kid seemed to be testing me. But the constant interruptions got under my skin. Every time I'd get into a flow, or just as I'd hit a productive streak, there'd be that doorknob rattle, the creak of hinges, and his face peeking through the doorway as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I tried ignoring him, hoping he'd lose interest. I even took to closing the door a bit more forcefully, hoping the loud sound would deter him. But it seemed like the more I ignored him, the more persistent he became, like he saw it as a game. He'd slam the door shut or leave it half open, letting it swing gently until someone in the office got up to close it. What baffled me more was that no one from his mother's office, the telemarketing group down the hall, ever stepped out to check on him or intervene. It was as though they had no idea, or worse, no interest in stopping him. It seemed they were more than content to let him run wild, using the hallways as his personal playground. And while I could forgive an occasional intrusion, this was becoming routine. As each day passed, my patience wore thin. I tried to think about how best to handle it, whether to approach his mother or bring it up to building management. But I hesitated, hoping it would just stop on its own, that someone would step up and do the right thing. But that didn't happen. Instead, each day brought the same disruption, each day a little louder than the one before. It was clear he wasn't going to stop on his own, and no one else seemed remotely inclined to stop him. And it was only a matter of time before something would have to give. I thought I could keep my cool. I truly did. After all, what kind of grown adult lets a kid get to them? That's what I told myself every time he came back. Every time I'd hear that rapid set of footsteps pounding down the hallway toward my door. But after 2 straight weeks of this nonsense, my patience was a threadbare string. And every time he barged in unannounced, it frayed a little more. One afternoon, the kid decided to up his game. He'd gone from a quick peek to holding the door wide open, then slamming it shut with all the force a 7-year-old could muster. And this time, he repeated it, slam, open, as though he was testing how much noise he could make before someone snapped. My head pounded with each bang, every thud ricocheting through the quiet office like gunfire. I glanced around, expecting my colleagues to show some reaction. They exchanged tired, helpless looks but said nothing, probably assuming, as I had before, that it would stop eventually. But it didn't. The kid had figured out he could get a rise out of us. And that afternoon he was like a wound-up toy, oblivious to the exasperation he was leaving in his wake. I tried to focus on my work, telling myself I could ignore it, let him tire himself out. But this game of his, it felt personal, like a challenge he was throwing at me, daring me to be the adult. Daring me to be the one to let it slide, while he strutted off, consequence-free. After the 4th or 5th slam, I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted up from my chair, adrenaline rushing, and threw open the door just as he reached out to grab the knob again. He froze mid-motion, eyes wide as he realized he'd been caught. "What do you think you're doing?" I snapped, my voice sharper than I'd intended. I could see the surprise in his face. This probably wasn't the reaction he was used to. But he didn't seem all that fazed by it either. He only blinked at me, silent, that impish grin still tugging at the corners of his mouth. For a second, I thought he might apologize. But instead, he just shrugged, brushed past me, and walked back down the hallway toward his mother's office as if nothing had happened. That was the moment when I knew this wasn't going to end with just words. The time for patience and tolerance had come and gone, and now it was up to me to make my voice heard. As I walked toward his mother's office, the righteous anger I tried to keep under wraps surged within me. And all the exasperation from weeks of constant interruptions came pouring out. I stormed down the hallway, every step fueled by the frustration that had been building for weeks. When I reached the office door where I'd seen the kid disappear, I didn't even pause. I pushed it open and stepped in, letting the door swing back behind me. Heads turned. A few people sitting at desks looked up, wide-eyed, taken aback by my entrance. I barely noticed. My gaze locked on the woman I assumed was his mother. She was seated near the back, casually chatting with a coworker, seemingly oblivious to the chaos her son was causing in the hallway. I took a deep breath, fighting to keep my voice steady but firm. I wasn't there to throw a tantrum. I just wanted the madness to stop. "Excuse me," I said, my tone sharp enough to cut through the silence that had settled over the room. "I need to talk to whoever's responsible for the kid who's been opening and slamming our office door every afternoon." Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, there was a flash of recognition mixed with something like embarrassment. She straightened in her chair, her posture stiffening, but there was also a flicker of defiance. "That would be my son," she said coolly, as if daring me to say something about it. "Is there a problem?" "Problem?" I echoed, unable to believe the casualness in her tone. "Yes, there's a problem. Every day, he's in and out of our office, slamming doors and disrupting us. I work in a law office. I need quiet to concentrate. And I'm guessing you wouldn't appreciate it if one of us barged in here repeatedly. Either." She raised an eyebrow, glancing at a couple of her coworkers as if she were trying to gauge whether they'd back her up. When she looked back at me, there was a hint of a smirk on her face. "He's just a kid," she said, shrugging. "Kids get bored. It's not like he's hurting anyone." "Bored?" I repeated, incredulous. "Look, I get that kids can get restless. But this isn't about him being bored. It's about respect. Respect for people trying to work. Respect for the fact that this is a shared building. And respect for my sanity. Honestly. Because I can't take any more of his constant interruptions. It's beyond reasonable now. She rolled her eyes, clearly unimpressed. I could feel my patience wearing down to a thread. But I was determined to keep my cool. All I wanted was acknowledgement, a simple assurance that she'd talk to him. That she'd tell him to knock it off. Instead, she muttered under her breath. Something about people needing to lighten up. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to let her words slide. But my voice dropped lower. More forceful than before. I filed a complaint with building management. I said, "And this conversation? It's your last chance to resolve this without it going any further. I don't care if he's 7 or 70. He needs to stay out of our office." I let the silence hang there, watching as the color drained from her face just slightly. It was clear the conversation was over, whether or not she agreed with me. She finally understood I wasn't going to keep tolerating it. I turned, walked back down the hall to my own office, and shut the door behind me, hoping I'd finally put an end to the ordeal. The next morning, I walked into the building with a sense of uneasy victory. Maybe I had been blunt, but I didn't regret confronting her. I figured, after everything, maybe this would mark the end of those daily disruptions. Maybe I'd finally have a quiet workday. However, I quickly realized things hadn't gone quite as I'd expected. As I approached my office, I could feel eyes on me. Whispers trailing in my wake. It was like walking into a cloud of static. Everyone muttering and glancing in my direction. The tension in the hallway was thick, buzzing with something unspoken. I went to my desk, trying to ignore the knot of dread settling in my stomach. The whispers became clearer, small fragments reaching me over the usual office hum. "That's her. She's the one who yelled at the kid. Can you believe it?" The words hit harder than I'd expected. More sting than murmur. I tried to focus on my work, but each time I caught someone's eyes darting away. Each murmur that crossed the room. It was a needle pricking my already frayed nerves. Part of me wanted to shake it off. I knew I'd done nothing wrong. And yet, the sensation of being singled out, of having the entire building in on some silent judgment, was enough to make me want to shrink. By midday, I'd had enough of the sidelong glances. I took my lunch break early, hoping a walk outside would clear my head. But as I passed the elevator, a few women from the telemarketing office spotted me, and one of them made a show of looking me up and down, raising her eyebrows and muttering, just loud enough for me to hear, "That's the one who thought yelling at a kid was the way to go. Poor thing, what a mess." A flash of anger rose in me, but I bit my tongue. They didn't know the entire story. They didn't know that I tried to handle it quietly until things had gotten out of control. And even if they did, would they really care? To them, I was just that lady, the villain in whatever story had spread across the building. Back in my office, I tried to drown out the distractions with work, burying myself in emails, reviewing contracts. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that things had spiraled beyond what I'd intended. All I wanted was a little peace, a break from the incessant distractions. Yet here I was, feeling like I'd upended some delicate balance. Disrupted everyone else's day just as much as that kid had disrupted mine. A few hours later, my manager pulled me aside. He'd heard about the incident, too, apparently, and though he wasn't exactly scolding me, he did point out that building harmony was important. He used phrases like, maintaining positive relations, and de-escalation techniques. But I could tell he was just as irritated by the complaints rolling in as I was by the original situation. I walked away from his office, feeling a mix of frustration and resignation. It wasn't supposed to be this way. I wasn't supposed to feel like I was the problem here, like I was the one who'd crossed a line. I decided to keep a low profile for the next few days, hoping the gossip would die down and things would get back to normal. My intention hadn't been to create a spectacle. I just wanted to address a real issue affecting my work. But instead, I'd become some kind of office pariah, whispered about and treated like the antagonist in a story I had no say in. As I walked into the office that Friday, I spotted a familiar figure, the woman with the child who'd been wreaking havoc. She was standing outside her office, chatting animatedly with some of her coworkers, her voice loud enough to carry. When she noticed me, her eyes narrowed slightly, her lips pursed. I could feel the judgment radiating off her, her stance signaling her distaste with every fiber of her being. I half expected her to walk over, maybe offer an apology, Or at the very least acknowledge that things had gotten out of hand. But she stayed exactly where she was, arms crossed, watching me as if daring me to start something. It was maddening. The woman had let her child turn the office hallway into a playground for weeks. And yet, she seemed to think I was the one who needed to back down. As though I were the one who'd crossed a line. That day, I noticed a shift in the way my own coworkers treated me. Too, a few colleagues I'd been friendly with suddenly seemed distant, offering only curt nods in the hallway or avoiding eye contact altogether. It felt like every step I took in the building was observed and critiqued. Like there was an unspoken divide drawn between me and everyone else. No one outright said anything, but the coldness was unmistakable. I couldn't help but replay the scene in my mind. Had I been too harsh? Should I have handled things differently? But then I'd remember the endless slamming of my office door. The frustration of being forced to stop my work every few minutes to get up and close it. I reminded myself that I'd asked nicely at first. I'd waited, hoping it would stop on its own. One of my closest friends at work finally pulled me aside near the coffee machine. "Look," she said softly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "People think you went overboard. I know why you were upset. But, word gets around. And now they're making a bigger deal of it than it was." I sighed, feeling the weight of the entire situation pressing down on me. All I'd wanted was a bit of peace and quiet in my workspace. And now, here I was, seen as some villainous figure for daring to address it. It was surreal. Like I'd woken up in an alternate version of my life where normal requests were met with silent outrage. As the day ended, I passed by their office again, trying to hold my head high. But inside, I felt drained. I glanced at the woman's desk, hoping she might look up, meet my eyes, maybe even offer some kind of acknowledgement that, yes, she understood where I was coming from. But instead, she kept her gaze firmly fixed on her computer screen, her back straight, her expression carefully neutral. There would be no apology, no understanding, and with that realization, a sense of finality settled over me. If I couldn't change her perspective, then I would let it go. I'd done what I thought was right. Now, it was up to them to handle it however they wanted. After a full week of being the office's silent antagonist, I thought the incident might have started fading from people's minds. But that hope was short-lived. The silent treatment from my colleagues continued, and the resentment was impossible to ignore. Every conversation seemed to fall quiet as soon as I approached, as if they all expected me to go off on a tirade about noise levels or telemarketers. The tension settled into the air, sour and pervasive, turning my workplace into a minefield. Then, as if on cue, an email popped up in my inbox one morning. A notice from building management requesting a meeting to resolve recent inter-office conflicts. I rolled my eyes, irritation bubbling up once again. I'd been vocal once, about an issue that had driven me to the edge of sanity. Now, I was being summoned like a misbehaving child who needed to be disciplined. But fine, if they wanted a meeting, they'd get one. The following day, I sat across from the building manager. A stern woman with reading glasses perched on the end of her nose and a clipboard at the ready. The telemarketing office manager sat beside her, and I noticed the woman whose child had been wreaking havoc around the office had chosen to join as well. Her face stony and unreadable. "We're here to discuss," the building manager began, adjusting her glasses, "some concerns about inter-office courtesy and respecting shared spaces." My jaw clenched. "I understand," I replied, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. She continued, "It's been brought to my attention that there was a confrontation last week involving noise levels. And I believe some words were exchanged that may have escalated the situation." I glanced at the telemarketing office manager, who immediately looked away, leaving the mother's hardened stare to meet my own. I struggled to hold back my frustration. I agree that some of my words could have been phrased better, I admitted, knowing that acknowledging this was probably the only way to end this circus. But I'd also like to stress that the door slamming was a persistent problem. This isn't about a single event, it's about weeks of disruption. The mother spoke up, voice cold but controlled. "Look, I get that he was playing a little rough. But he's a kid. Kids are restless. They move around, and sometimes, they make noise." "Yes," I replied carefully, "but the expectation of a workplace is that it stays professional. And your child was regularly interfering with that environment. I have deadlines to meet, clients to please, And it's hard to concentrate when every few minutes I have to stop to close my door. The building manager interjected with a conciliatory tone. There seems to be frustration on both sides. Is there a way we can all come to an understanding here? The room fell silent. For a moment, I considered an apology, perhaps a way to smooth things over. But something in me hesitated. I'd already tried to bring the issue up politely. For weeks, I'd kept quiet for as long as I could bear. And now, after that one outburst, I was the one in the hot seat. The mother crossed her arms, clearly expecting some kind of apology. I could feel the pressure to give in and keep the peace. But then, it hit me. An apology would only affirm that I had been in the wrong when all I wanted was to do my job in a space free from unnecessary distraction. After a few tense seconds, I took a deep breath. I respect that you're a mother. And I understand that kids are, well, kids, but we all have a job to do here. And I'm simply asking for consideration moving forward. I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that from everyone. The building manager looked between us, nodded, and concluded, perhaps we can all agree that professionalism includes respect for everyone's work environment. Moving forward, let's try to maintain a quieter space during office hours. Thank you both for coming. As I left the meeting, I realized that while I might still be the subject of hallway whispers, I had made my position clear. I wasn't about to apologize for expecting the bare minimum, a workplace that functioned like one. If that made me the villain in their story, then so be it. I'd rather stand by my principles than let misplaced guilt drag me into an endless cycle of excuses and tolerance for things that shouldn't be tolerated in the first place. Returning to my office, I noticed the usual quiet nods and sidelong glances. But this time I wasn't sure if they held judgment or grudging respect. The meeting had stirred something, not just within the telemarketing office but throughout the whole floor. It was subtle, but I could feel a shift in the air. For the first time, people seemed wary, as if my stand had broken some unspoken rule. It was like I'd unknowingly signed up for a role no one wanted to play. The next few days passed in strange silence. I could sense people watching, testing how far they could push boundaries without a reaction from me. My colleagues in our office seemed distant, keeping to themselves. It was as though they were calculating if my frustration could one day turn on them. The hall was quieter, though, and that was a victory in itself. The kid who'd once made it his mission to open and slam our door now avoided our office entirely. I didn't miss his disruptions, but I could tell that others in our office were wondering if my outburst had crossed a line. Then came the whispers. First, I overheard fragments of conversations between colleagues in the break room and down the hall, people murmuring about the lawyer who snapped. Some laughed, while others seemed genuinely appalled that I'd been so direct. One overheard snippet struck a nerve. I wouldn't want to share a workspace with her. Someone whispered. I told myself it didn't matter, that I hadn't said anything unreasonable. But the seed of doubt was hard to ignore. Over the weekend, I spent hours going over the situation in my mind. Maybe I could have chosen different words. Maybe I should have gone straight to the building manager rather than confront the office. But there was an undeniable satisfaction in knowing that, for once, I hadn't kept my frustration to myself. Years of dealing with everyone else's expectations, constantly biting my tongue, and now, finally, I'd been heard. That Sunday, as I mentally prepared for the coming work week, I felt the familiar tug of guilt creeping in again, telling me to reach out and smooth things over. I could see how my actions had made me an outsider, but I felt torn between apologizing for keeping the peace and standing my ground for the sake of some sanity at work. I knew I was well within my rights to expect a quiet, respectful workspace, and I didn't want to backtrack on that. When Monday came around, I held my head high, preparing for the tension that was likely waiting for me. I walked down the hall, meeting every glance with steady eyes. Part of me wondered if I'd lost friends or even respect. But I'd finally found a sense of self-assuredness that I didn't want to give up. If I was going to be the office villain, at least I'd be one who didn't compromise on basic respect and professionalism. Monday rolled on, each hour stretching longer than the last as I dodged the passive-aggressive glares from the telemarketers and the uncomfortable glances from my colleagues. As the day wore on, I started to wonder if my stance had been worth it. Maybe I could have handled things with less intensity. But then, just as the clock inched toward 5, something surprising happened. Carol, one of the paralegals in my office, approached my desk. Carol was the sort of person who preferred her routine and never had a hair out of place. She'd always seemed a bit wary of me. But today, she looked supportive. "Hey," she said, lowering her voice. "I just wanted to say that I don't think you did anything wrong last week. I mean, that kid was obnoxious. A bunch of us have been dealing with it too. And it's only gotten worse with time. You probably said what we were all thinking." Her words took me off guard. I hadn't expected anyone in my office, especially Carol, to side with me. I thanked her, feeling a sense of camaraderie. But before I could say more, another colleague chimed in, a quiet guy named Mark who handled tax law. Someone who'd hardly said more than 5 words to me since I started here. Mark nodded in agreement. "Yeah, it's been an issue for a while," he said, adjusting his glasses awkwardly. "I don't know why they bring him around when he's so disruptive. It's like they don't realize other people are working here too." More nods followed, and soon others around the office voiced their own frustrations about the noisy kid and, more broadly, about the way we all constantly tiptoed around each other instead of addressing problems directly. I hadn't expected that my outburst would bring out this wave of honesty. By the end of the day, I felt a renewed sense of confidence. I'd managed to spark something, even if it wasn't necessarily planned. For the first time, it seemed like everyone was more comfortable speaking openly instead of hiding behind polite silence. And with each supportive nod and word of understanding, I felt my own anxieties about the incident ease. But as I gathered my things to leave, I wondered what kind of long-term consequences I might face for challenging the status quo. The dust settled slowly, almost imperceptibly, in the weeks that followed my outburst. Though the glares from the telemarketers persisted for a while, their novelty wore off with time, fading to occasional annoyed glances and muttered whispers. The chatter around the incident gradually quieted, too, as people found new things to talk about. But for me, that moment lingered, transforming into something else altogether, a sort of awakening. The office kid never returned. The hallways became silent once again, which was a small relief, though I knew it was hardly the primary victory. But beyond the calm, something in the atmosphere had changed. People at my office were speaking up more often, voicing concerns about little issues, like the cleaning schedule or setting boundaries with other offices. Conversations felt more open, and there was less of that uncomfortable tension that had always hummed beneath the surface. Over time, my relationships with my colleagues began to evolve. Carol and I started grabbing coffee on Fridays, chatting about everything from work frustrations to the books we were reading. Mark, though still reserved, would sometimes swing by my desk to share a quiet observation or a good movie recommendation. These small gestures felt like the start of a truer sense of camaraderie, one I hadn't thought possible before. And I, in my own way, had changed too. The whole ordeal had stripped me of some of the filters I'd wrapped around myself. Filters meant to keep the peace or avoid tension. Now, I didn't mind speaking up, even if it was uncomfortable. I no longer felt the need to always be polite at the expense of honesty. With each day, I grew more certain that setting boundaries, even if it stirred up some drama, was an act of self-respect rather than selfishness. As for the telemarketing office down the hall, we found a new rhythm. We didn't exchange friendly hellos or fake pleasantries. But that was okay. Respect doesn't always look like friendship. Sometimes, it's just the quiet understanding that we're all doing our best in shared spaces. I'd drawn my line, they'd drawn theirs, and somehow, it worked. In the end, what began as a moment of exasperation became a lesson I hadn't known I needed. Life in shared spaces, whether it's with family, friends, or strangers, is about finding balance. It's about voicing needs, even when it's uncomfortable, and creating space for others to do the same. And as I walked the quiet halls of our office building, I realized that peace wasn't about avoiding conflict. It was about finding my own calm within it.